You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you in further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Welcome to the Deeper Waters Podcast. I am your host, Nick Peters, bringing you the very best in Christian scholarship and apologetics, and we've got a lively show planned for today because it's the second time we've done this, but we are going to have a debate on the Deeper Waters Podcast, and it's going to be an in-house Christian debate, just like last time. And how the story was, Jay Hall sent me an email a while back saying he had a book on young Earth creationism, and he wanted to come on my show and talk about it. I said, I'm open to this, but I'm not a young Earth creationist myself, and I don't support it in that way, but if you want to come on and support it, how about we be fair then and have an old Earth creationist come on, and have you two have an exchange back and forth? And he said, that'd be fine. So I went off onto the Old Earth Creationist Facebook page I'm a member of and said, hey, who wants to come and do a debate? And I put up the information, and Ben Smith volunteered. So let me tell you a little bit about both of these guys here. First, we'll start with Jay. Jay Hall is Assistant Mathematics Professor at Howard College in Big Spring, Texas, because everything's bigger in Texas, you know. He has a Master of Science degree in Mathematics from the University of Oklahoma. He has 53 credit hours of science courses in various disciplines. He has taught at the high school, technical school, and community college levels. He also has experience in the actuarial field, which I hope I pronounced that correctly, for a number of insurance and consulting organizations. Hall has previously published the math textbook Calculus is Easy, and has a paper on Math Word, 17th Ellipse. He is also a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. You may contact Jay Hall at youngearthscience@yahoo.com. His website is youngearthsciencebook.com, and we've got a link at our website where you can find the Yes Young Earth Science YouTube page and connect on the various social media platforms. So, Jay, welcome to the Deeper Waters Podcast.
Nice to be here.
Tell us a little bit briefly about how you got to be doing what you're doing here.
Well, I like to express my pro-life sentiments, by saying that I was conceived in Oklahoma, born in Maryland, and grew up in Northern Virginia.
Okay.
So I didn't actually have an early interest in geology or math. I was kind of a late bloomer, and my first major was actually geology. And then at that time in the early 80s, the oil industry kind of had a slip, like it's had recently as well, and I decided, well, what else could I get into? And of course, you have to have a lot of math and physics and science to have a geology degree. So, and the only two awards I got in high school were both math related. So I thought, well, what about math? And so I went that direction. And one of my undergraduate professors encouraged me to go to graduate school, and I had a number of people to help me out through my church to be able to be successful at that, and pretty much all forms of aid going through school, I received it, helping from friends and from church, and the different grants that are available. But actually, once I was in graduate school, I actually paid my own way as a graduate teaching assistant. And how I became a Christian was my mom gave me a Bible when I was about 14, and I just read it through, and I just knew it was the Word of God. And then one of the radio stations in Northern Virginia dealt with apologetics topics, and actually it was Harold Camping, believe it or not. Of course, He had some wild ideas, but that actually I can thank him for being introduced to some creationism.
Honestly, at the start when you talk about geology, the only thing I could think of the time being, and it's because my wife and I are big fans of the Big Bang Theory, and you have this quote in your book, it's Sheldon Cooper just saying, geology isn't an actual science, over and over.
Yes, with a paintball fight.
Yes, I see you remember that episode too. Well, thank you for coming on here. And now let's go to Ben Smith. Ben Smith has been studying and teaching theology and apologetics for 30 years since becoming a Christian while attending Georgia Tech. He is the author of the book Genesis, Science, and the Beginning, available now on Amazon and Kindle. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Christian Worldview and Apologetics from Luther Rice College and Seminary. He is a Ratio Christi Chapter Director at the University of West Georgia in Carrollton, Georgia. Teaches apologetics at Christ Fellowship Church and is a regular speaker at the Atlanta chapter of Reasons to Believe Ministries, which meets at Johnson's Ferry Baptist Church in Marietta, Georgia. He is president of Discovering the Truth Ministries. So,
hi, Nick. Good to be here.
Welcome to the show. Now,
thank you.
Could you tell my audience a little bit about how you got to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I was raised in a Southern Baptist church, and then we moved to New Jersey in the mid-'70s, and I pretty much wasn't in church for about 6 or 7 years. And during that time, I graduated high school and then came back to Georgia Tech to go to school. And I looked forward to starting to go back to church again. During my time at Georgia Tech, I was a little bit wild, and so I devoted my life to following Christ in 1985. And I was at a youth meeting, and a speaker there started talking about evidence for the Bible being true, and it really piqued my interest. And so I asked him for some references, and he referred me to some creationist literature, which I basically began devouring at that time. And for about 10 years, I devoured every young earth creationist literature that I could possibly find. Was a very devout, zealous believer in young earth creationism. But somewhere about in the mid-'90s, I picked up a book by Hugh Ross, and realized that the depth of my science knowledge wasn't what I thought it was, and that he had some really good arguments. And so I went into a very long search for the truth on that subject. So for about 10 years, I waffled back and forth, and then finally came to realize that the science evidence was really quite strong, that the earth and the universe were old. So it made me re-examine the Genesis account. I was doing an apologetics outline for a class that I was getting ready to teach, and in that outline, I was going to go through my view of Genesis, but I did a very deep study of every view of Genesis I could possibly find, which basically led to the book that I ended up writing, which was released just recently, called Genesis, Science, and the Beginning. And I went through every view I could find, and then later on the show we'll go through our views of Genesis. But I find that old earth creationists generally had spent most of their time concentrating on science, and young earth concentrated a lot on theology. And I wanted to show that you could also concentrate on theology and interpretation of the Bible, even as an old earth creationist. So that's a little about me and how I came to be where I'm at. But I've been interested in teaching apologetics for some 30 years. Been quite enlightening to me and fun in the process too.
If anyone's interested, also Hugh Ross was actually back on our show on April 5th of 2014, and talking about the topic of Asperger's and apologetics, something very near and dear to my heart, since Hugh is actually an Aspie, just like my wife and I are. So that's a very interesting conversation if anyone's interested in hearing that. And Ben, I understand also that you and I are both going to be in Atlanta next week.
That's correct. Conveniently, the Evangelical Theological Society meeting, annual meeting, is in Atlanta. So,
and that includes the Philosophical Society and the Society of Biblical Literature. And if anyone's interested in seeing me there, look for Mike Licona. I'll be nearby. And if they want to see you there, where do they go?
I will be at the Solid Rock Lectures table with Ken Wohlgemuth. And I'll actually have my book there as well. So, yeah, I'll be at his table.
Okay. Well, Jay, we're going to start with you because we've already agreed the first hour, or first half, I should say, we're going to be talking about science, and then the second half we're going to switch to biblical interpretation. Now, something I found interesting about your book was it really didn't have anything biblical, per se, in there. It was entirely science focused, and I'm really not used to seeing that when I meet arguments for young Earth creationism, but you think the science is pretty firmly on your side. Now, of course, we can't go into every single scientific argument out there, but go ahead and start us with what you think is your major scientific argument, and we'll just see what Ben has to say about it.
Oh, sure. One thing that might be a little bit unique is where I talk about fossil trees. I do want to give a caveat about what you said about my book, in that Prehistory and Earth Models by Melvin Cook did pretty much the same thing years ago, and that he tried to stick with mostly a scientific argument. So I'm not the first to do this, but the first in a long time, put it that way. Well, the fossils that we find that are trees, some we can count the rings, but due to where it turns into minerals, it's hard to read. But the one that has the most number of rings, not how old it is, dated by standard geology, but the one with the most number of rings has 816 rings. That's a lot. And if you want to look at it, all you have to do is search, there's the giant sequoias, the giant redwoods. You can just search Sequoia 89 by 68, because that's its size. And it's the first thing that pops up. But the question is, where are the trees with thousands of rings? And that's what we would expect if the Earth is really millions of years old, from the way I'm looking at it. So a bunch of trees besides the sequoias. You have the redwoods, the bristlecone pines, junipers, even olive trees. That kind of surprised me. I didn't know that until I researched this a little more deeply. But all of those can have thousands of rings. So the fossil record doesn't seem to produce them. But again, the standard time frame from creation to the flood, say roughly, Usher's roughly correct, is around 1,600 plus years. Well, we wouldn't expect trees to be even older than that. And like I said, the oldest one that we find has 816 rings. So it's kind of a question of, we don't see something, but then it's sort of like, well, why don't we see the transitional forms when we're arguing against evolution? It's sort of a similar thing. But according to the standard dating, the oldest trees, that is forest trees, like you would find in Georgia or Virginia, where I grew up, is 385 million years ago. So for 385 million years, we've had trees that had rings, but yet we can't find any that have thousands of rings. And so it's the most common excuse, I would think, would be that the fossil record is lacking. But an interesting book came out in 1998 that actually dealt with that specific issue. It's called The Adequacy of the Fossil Record, and it was published by Wiley, a standard scientific publisher. And they kind of dealt with it from the idea of maybe, say, standard evolution maybe versus punctuated equilibrium, but it does try to document that overall the fossil record is pretty much complete, and again, from a standard source. So that's essentially my argument about the trees.
Well, I'm not someone who's scientifically literate, and I hear that, and I think, I'm not really sure what I would say to that, but Ben, I'm sure you've heard this argument before. What do you think?
Well, strangely enough, until I had read his book, I don't think I had heard this as an argument for an old Earth. What we're talking about here, when he says the oldest fossilized tree that we have, or the most rings, is around 815 years, but there are currently living trees. Actually, the website that he gets some of his information from, he's got the bristlecone pine at 4,844 years, has updated it to 5,060 years now, as the oldest current living tree. But the reason I would say we don't have a lot of fossilized trees in the geological record, though, is that long-lived trees are not really in depositional type of environments. In other words, they're in erosional environments in terms of geology. They grow at high elevations. They're on mountains where fossils are not being formed. Whether we have an accurate or a good representational fossil record over the years, I guess, is debatable. And I'm in agreement that I don't think we're going to find transitional forms. I don't expect that in the record, because I agree, I'm not an evolutionist. However, when it comes to what we should find in the record, it's difficult to say we should find trees that are thousands of years old, because most trees simply don't survive to that age. Most of them either burn down in normal natural fires caused by lightning, or are knocked down by storms, because some of the biggest trees, at least in this area where we are, when they get that big, usually about a couple of 100 years old, they fall over, and then they rot, and so they would never be in a circumstance where they would be fossilized. At best, this looks like an argument from silence to me. It's just saying that we don't have record of it, but we should, and so I don't necessarily think that we should have a record of it. Plus, I also think that if we were to find a fossilized tree that had 5,000 or 6,000 rings on it, young Earth creationists would probably say it doesn't cause them a problem somehow or another. I actually tend to think that, even though I agree that occasionally you can get two rings on a tree in a year, the very fact that we have a tree that's over 5,000 years old is not in agreement with young Earth creationists' a strict time frame anyway, because it's older than the date of the flood, which they would say is around 4,500 BC. So that'd be my initial response anyway.
Hey, Jay, what do you think about that?
Well, the giant red ones in California, I don't know exactly their elevation, but for some of these trees, I think the sequoias, a reference in my book, we're a scholar that studied trees, because they all are no older than that, because they seem to be almost so impervious to disease. He suggests, as I mentioned in my book, that there was a great catastrophe. So it almost likes the fact that there is a limitation. They're no older than the 5,000 years, I think points to the global catastrophe that happened a few thousand years ago.
Well, the fact that the redwood forests are there when they began to grow, when conditions were just right for them to grow again, is something that's difficult to say. They are very limited to that particular spot in California for the most part that I'm aware of. And there are dead trees there. They do fall over and die. They're not all the same age. So I would say that probably what we're looking at there is about the limit of how long they live. So that's the best I can tell you on that. I don't think that it points to a global catastrophe at a particular time ago.
Yeah. Jay, how about you wrap up this point on the trees for now, and then I'm going to bounce it to Ben to give a scientific argument he thinks applies to an old Earth.
Well, I think I'm good on that point.
Okay. Now, Ben, some people might say, well, what evidence do we have that the Earth is really old? I mean, isn't a lot of us all just conjecture and such? I mean, what's your best evidence in your mind for an old Earth?
Yeah, and just so your audience knows too, by the way, Jay and I and yourself had agreed to limit our responses to a number of our best choices here, rather than talk about the hundreds of options that we could talk about. I put 3 of them in my book. The one that was probably the first one that I came across that was the most convincing to me was an argument from Hugh Ross, which was about the age of supernova remnants.
Mm-hmm.
A supernova basically is an exploded star. Okay, after a certain amount of time, which is a long time, billions of years, conditions become right that a star will collapse on itself and explode out in rather dramatic fashion and become one of the brightest spots in the sky. When that happens, it leaves an expanding gas cloud which is visible. In 1054, the Chinese recorded a supernova in the constellation of Taurus, and today when we look in that location where they said it was, we see the remnants of an exploded star called the Crab Nebula. Mm-hmm. And the Crab Nebula is basically 6,500 light years away, and this supposedly occurred 1,000 years ago. So we're already beyond the date of creation according to young Earth creationists. But the other problem is that we can see other supernova remnants across the galaxy and across, in some cases, in other galaxies that, we see them across our galaxy, not in other galaxies. Mm-hmm. But we see that they've been expanding a lot longer than is possible. You can basically measure how long it's been expanding, the rate it is expanding, and go backwards from there and extrapolate it in terms of how long it has been since the star exploded. And in some cases, it's been millions of years that the gas cloud has been expanding, and that seems to be pretty straightforward, and it's observational in terms of measuring the actual gas cloud dispersion rate. So you either got to make a choice that that God somehow created an expanding gas cloud that looks like an exploded star, or it really was a star that exploded, in some cases, a million or more years ago. So that's one of the best evidences I had no explanation for.
If I'm remembering
when I was a young Earth creationist.
Yeah. If I'm remembering my history correctly, wasn't there one seen around the 1500s or so that really shattered our viewpoint a lot, because Aristotle and others have given us a viewpoint that the heavens are just perfect, and then we saw a supernova explode. Okay, there was something wrong here. That's correct, isn't it?
I'm not familiar with that story, but I can see where somebody would think that, and now that we've come to understand how far away those events are, there was a supernova in 1987 that occurred in the Large Magellanic Cloud, which is 160,000 light years away from us. So again, you've got a situation where it took 160,000 years for the light to reach us, and we're just now seeing a supernova go off. So again, we would have to conclude one of two things: either God created an illusion, which even young Earth creationists really aren't willing to admit, or that star really did explode that far away, and we're just now seeing it.
Okay. Well, Jay, I have to say that I've generally found that to be something that sounds pretty convincing, because it sounds like if we go against it, we're saying that God's created something with the appearance of age, which seems a bit deceptive. So what do you think about it?
Well, I want to bring up two issues. I'm going to talk about the expansion in a second, but I'm sure that Ben's familiar with the argument from the Count that Keith Davies is known for, not to be confused with Paul Davies, of course, famous for the anthropic principle. But basically what he did is kept track of the different stages. So when the star explodes, after a while you have this supernova remnant, like Ben said. And the first stage lasts about 300 years. In the second stage, you have powerful radio source. And then in the third stage, in some cases, it could last up to 6 million years by the standard dating. And so what Keith Davies did, he broke it down into what an old galaxy would predict and what the galaxy's thousands of years old would predict. And for the first stage, we count 2 in both cases, and theoretically, and we actually see 5. And in the second stage, for billions of years, you'd expect thousands, and if the galaxy is thousands of years old, you'd expect 125. What we've observed is 200. So again, not an exact match, but the young galaxy version is closer. Now, what's really strange is that for the third stage, again, multiple thousands if the galaxy is billions of years old, but none if the galaxy is just thousands of years old. And so far, there's been no third stage supernova remnants discovered.
Well,
now,
okay,
go ahead.
I was just
I was going to get to the expansion part of it, but go ahead with what you wanted to say, Nick.
I was just going to say that I just did do some checking, and it was Tycho Brahe's supernova. It took place in 1572, and looks like a star in Cassiopeia. So for all you history buffs up there, go ahead. Now, what were you going to say about the expansion, Jay?
All right. Well, Keith Davies, he's working on his MS in astrophysics, and so this has been a kind of a focus on his research. And in 2006, Journal of Creation, he talks about the Cygnus Loop. Now, it's in Cygnus the Swan, that constellation. But what's interesting is at one time it was thought to be 150,000 years old. Now he thinks it might be as young as 1,700 years. So there's several stages of revision of the data and interpretation. But like Ben said, you got to consider the distance. All these things have to put into it. But there are two key parameters, basically. The diameter of the object, and then the density of the interstellar medium. In other words, how dense is space? Like between galaxies, it's considered to be one thing. Between stars, it's considered to be something else. But what Davies brings out is that the initial estimates were off by a factor of 10. So that brought the time scale down. And then the diameter measurement of the Cygnus Loop, which is a supernova remnant in our galaxy, the Milky Way, it was revised from 56 parsecs to 25 parsecs. Again, you hear that maybe in Star Wars or Star Trek. Doesn't mean a whole lot. But 1 parsec is about 3.26 light years. 1 light year is about 10 to the 13th kilometers. And to give a more concrete concept, 1 mile is about 1.6 kilometers. So if you have a tight string on a violin, it's going to get a different sound than if you have, like, say, a bass string on a guitar. So it's sort of a rough analogy with how space is. Well, one paper that was published in the Royal Astronomical Society in 2005 suggested, based on evidence they came up with, reducing the density of the interstellar medium by 1,000 times. Well, of course, that has an implication on how you interpret how fast these supernova remnants expand, which of course correlates with the time scale.
Okay, well, Ben, that sounds like an interesting reply back. I'm not sure what I'd say to it. What do you have to say? Have you heard it before?
I've not heard arguments about density of the interstellar space being affecting our measurements here. I think I know what he's talking about when it comes to the Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 stars. But I'll come back to that in a minute now. But let me clarify, Jay. Are you saying that the expansion rates that we are recording today are inaccurate because of the density of the space between us? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because the formula just has basically 3 numbers. What is the diameter? What is the density? And then it has a time parameter. So once you have any 2, you can figure out the 3rd parameter.
All of the astronomical measurements that I've seen that in a number of Hugh Ross's books talk about the fact that no matter what we look at, particularly when it comes to like the frequency of pulsars and so forth, and types of supernovas that we can see, show that nothing is different out there in space at long distances. All of the physical properties are the same and operating at the same rates. So if you're talking about, I don't see where density of what we're looking through is going to cause a problem with our measuring of the rate. If you're just saying it's denser in space out there, or less dense, so that they're expanding faster, again, there doesn't seem to be a difference in well, for example, in the case of the star that the Chinese recorded, what we're looking at something that is expanding at the same rate that the historical date matches. So we're not seeing a difference in those two. So I would say that what we're measuring is the actual expansion rate of those objects. And then, of course, when you factor in how far away they are and how long it took the light to get to us, you've still got a serious problem going on here. As for the Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3, I think what he's referring to there is that when the universe began in a Big Bang scenario, you've got first-generation stars which would have come into existence and then burn out and exploded to become a lot of the material that we have available today. Then you've got second generation and third generation stars that end up doing the same thing. The problem with trying to measure supernova remnants of, say, first generation stars would be the universe. There are a lot of things that cause these gas clouds as they begin to expand out into space. They get as they get great distances away from where they originated, they get perturbed by a number of gravitational effects by other stars that are in existence. Time just basically erases the ripples that were once there. It'd be like trying to measure, a good example would be trying to measure the ripples in a pond of a pebble that was dropped in it hundreds of years ago. They've just merged into all the ripples that are in the pond, and you wouldn't be able to see those types of remnants. That's the reason why we don't see the supernova remnants of those first generation stars, and only the ones that are more recent. And there are plenty of them out there that we can see and measure to say that they have been expanding for that long and they are that far away. That'd be my answer to that.
Hey, Jay, what do you think?
Well, how they came up with the diameter, it basically got cut in half. Of course, that is related to the distance. So with more accurate measurements, that's how that got changed. And in terms of the reduction of the interstellar medium of the density, that applies to all supernova remnants. So it was a consideration based on research this author had done that it should possibly be reduced by 1,000 times. And of course, that has a direct effect on the expansion rate.
Okay.
But well, for example, the supernova that occurred at the Crab Nebula is really only 6,500 light years away. So we're really not talking about that far in terms of overall size of the Milky Way galaxy, for example, which is 100,000 light years across. So you're saying that the density of interstellar material between here and just 6,500 light years away, it's obvious it's not affecting what's going on because it's measurable. You see what I'm saying, Jay?
Yes. I guess I have to do a little further research on that. I'm just saying that I think that could be an answer for most of the supernova remnant expansions.
Well, I'd like to step in at this point and try each time to ask each of you what I would consider a hard question for your position. Going to do each of you trying to avoid bias, but Jay, we'll start with you for your position. Say, if this is what the science indicates, why is it that so many people who have studied the science, they haven't come to the view that the Earth or the universe is young?
Well, I've actually given that some thought. A number of scholars have written on the sociology of science, and there's some books on it. And science gets so specialized. One of the counterexamples would be the Human Genome Project, which involved a large amount of cooperation. But if I'm trying to develop a new drug, say, for example, to cure cancer, hopefully, well, I'm going to be kind of secretive and not have a whole lot of cooperation. Mm-hmm. But actually, we get into these specialties, and many scientists don't try to get a broad perspective. I sense that in many ways, since you brought up that historical aspect, you're a polymath, and I admire that very much. But so few people kind of have that attitude. We have a real scholar in our tutoring lab, even though she's not a PhD, like she knows everything, and she can tutor in all the subjects. But so few people have that perspective. And as an example, the physicists and the geologists use slightly different radioactive decay rates. Well, if we've nailed it and we put a golden stake, this is what it is, they ought to be able to agree.
Okay. Ben, what do you think?
Well, it was one of the things that made me really think about the state of science in the world when it kind of occurred to me one day that about 99% or 99.7% of geologists and astronomers would agree that the universe is very old. So if that many of them are wrong or deceived somehow, and we're not talking about other sciences like biology or whatever in terms of them thinking the age of the Earth. I'm just talking about 99% of geologists would say that the Earth is old. So if that many people believe it, there had to be something that was convincing them. Because there's a lot of Christians in there. So there's a lot of Christian geologists. So the problem can't be just some kind of bias in science. It's got to be involved with the evidence, and the same is true in astronomy. Now, some would say, well, 99% of biologists believe in evolution. I would disagree, actually. If you were to ask the question along the lines of how many people believe that God was involved in evolution in some form or fashion, I bet you would get a much larger percentage that would agree that that's true. So biology is much more complex. But in terms of geology and astronomy, with that many people believing that the evidence is that strong, it really made me take a much closer look at the evidence.
Okay, Jay, what do you think about that?
Well, I believe that worldview, presuppositions, and all these things are key. And over time, things have changed. You know, geologists didn't always believe in continental drift. I have a textbook on my bookshelf that they said, well, you know, the evidence seems to be pointing that way. It was published in the 60s. But there are a few scholars that are the geologists that are somewhat skeptical. So they at least, in a sense, quote unquote, discuss both sides. Obviously, towards the late 60s, it had been pretty much flipped towards plate tectonics, and the evidence pointed that direction. But I'm just saying that I get a better feedback from historians of science and also philosophers of science, and that's why I quoted Alexander Bird on the back of my book, where he admits that the young Earth view does not have a solid philosophical standpoint.
Okay. Now, Ben, I'd like to ask you what I consider a sort of hard question for you scientifically, is that since you're coming from a Christian viewpoint, and Jay was saying that, that worldviews do matter.
Are you asking me the question again now?
I'm asking
okay.
you, Ben.
Okay.
Jay was saying that worldviews matter, what you bring to a table matters and such. A lot of people could be looking and saying, well, Ben, you started saying, and we're going to get into scripture more of the next hour, but you started saying that you really had a hard time reconciling your view with science. And so, if for a Christian, are you not guilty of letting science interpret reality for you then? I mean, has science become supreme?
That is a good question. And when we were in at the Ratio Christi Symposium, a similar situation arose, and the young Earth creationists have said for years that old Earth creationists are reading science into the Bible. There is a similar situation in terms of people once believing that the sun rotated around the Earth, that the Earth was the center of the universe, that the Earth didn't move, for example. And what we've come to realize is that Scripture needs to be interpreted from a correct perspective. And since the Scripture is written from the perspective of the surface of the Earth, it gives what's known as a phenomenological perspective of the phenomenon that occur around us. So everybody still refers to the sun as rising and setting when we know that it's the Earth, of course, that's orbiting around the sun and rotating, and that's what's causing our view of it. So you could say that even though the Bible's not written as a science book, if you take the perspective of it into account, these things can come into perspective. In terms of age, we'll get into it next hour, but my studies in Genesis really came to show me that Genesis just doesn't commit us to an age, that it doesn't put us in that position. If it did, then that might be a problem. My initial interpretation of it, I thought that it did, but as I came to understand the interpretation of it a little bit better, I don't believe that it forced us into that position. And so in some cases, I think science could enlighten our understanding of certain biblical passages. I don't see that as too much of a problem. And in fact, it's even possible that some of the ancient interpreters of Scripture were committing the same problems. They were reading their own faulty understanding of the cosmos into their interpretation of Scripture.
Well, Jay, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that most of history, the young Earth position has been pretty well represented by scientists such as Isaac Newton, and that in terms of the early church fathers and so forth, I think they have largely held to what I would call a traditional creation position, creation in 6 days, global flood, young Earth. And it's interesting that both a minority, but some Roman Catholic scholars hold to the young Earth, some Russian Orthodox scholars hold to it, and of course some more traditional Jewish scholars would agree with the traditional starting date of the Hebrew calendar.
Ben, what do you think?
I really can't deny that the traditional position over time has mostly been that. However, I would point out that there have been a number of people who've cautioned their interpretation of Genesis, enforcing that over the years, like Augustine, for example. So, again, if a lot of those people had been presented with some of the scientific evidence that we have today, it makes me wonder whether they would have taken a closer look at what the Bible says. So it's not so much that we're always interpreting the Bible in light of science, but knowledge has always, or knowledge of the world around us has always caused us to take a look at the Bible through a biased sort of lens, if you will. So, say again?
Yeah, do you have a little bit more to say on that?
No, I would say that's it.
Well, Jay, give us another argument then that you find compelling for a young Earth.
All right. Well, John Sanford is well known for being involved in the development of the gene gun. So if you're anti-GMO, you can maybe send him a letter. But his basic point of his book, entitled Genetic Entropy, I believe the most recent edition is the 4th edition, is that more mutations implies man is gone. Now, how soon that will be, it's hard to say. But Michael Lynch, in a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2010, this is a quote from him, substantial reduction in human fitness can be expected over the next few centuries, unquote. So it's something that's hard to say, therefore, 2,000 years from there won't be humans. I haven't been able to find that. But in terms of the trend, the mutations accumulate, and I'm sure you've heard of stories where, inbreeding can lead to some bad situations. But in one estimate was that there's a 5% reduction in fitness per generation. And again, how long would that take? But just from that number mathematically, in just 45 generations, you'd have less than 10%. So there's a book, in my book, I reference a statement that women might have to have 40 kids so that 2 might survive. Now, we're not at that point yet, but it's like continue these trends where we're headed. And, of course, other creatures have, all kinds of offspring. But the number U, which represents the number of harmful mutations per person, the new ones, that is 3, according to this estimate that was in Genetics that I referenced in my book. But according to John Sanford, that estimate was way too low. He suggests the U should be around 30 to 90, which is a lot of bad mutations. Mm-hmm. So if that accumulates over time, and man has been on the earth for a long period of time, how is it that we can survive? And there was actually something in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, that was the title of the article, Why Have We Not Died 100 Times Over? And that came out in 95. So we have such a heavy load of mutations, we're driving toward extinction, and we don't hardly even know it. And, maybe at some point in time, through God's providence, we may have effective genetic therapies. Who knows? But in terms of the past, with all these mutations, how could we kind of live with it? So one suggestion was that humans may last only 100 generations. Now, again, if we took 50 years, which is, kind of maybe a big estimate for a generation, that would come out to 5,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically admitted that the bad mutation rate in hominids is pretty high. And then one article in Nature said, quote, "It is difficult to explain how human populations have survived," unquote. So the only way to offset it is to have everybody has to be Catholic. Everybody has to have tons and tons of kids. But yet, through history and through what we know of ancient man, we don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of those who might not be familiar with John Sanford, he was the lead author in a paper about genetic load that was presented in 2007 at the International Conference on Computational Science that was published by Springer Verlag. And his book, Genetic Entropy, was endorsed. Again, they might not take the whole kit and caboodle. They might not agree with everything, but just to say that he has some a significant standing. His book was endorsed by Philip Johnson, the father of intelligent design, as well as Michael Behe.
Well, Ben, that sounds like an interesting argument. I mean, does Jay have a point? Is every husband going to have a very happy duty he needs to fulfill now to sustain the human race, and every wife living in misery, or what?
Well, I do not disagree with him that genetic mutations accumulate over a period of time within species, and that will limit the length of time that, say, such species could be around on the Earth. Several things that I would point out, though, when it comes to this particular argument. First of all, we're talking about, in John Sanford's case here, we're talking about humans, so the more complicated the genetic material is, the more potential mutations you can have over a period of time. Plus, when you have low population levels, like in the case of humans, you have a much greater increase of mutations within a population. When you're talking about something like bacteria, for example, their genetic material is much simpler. Many more of them survive that are normal, that don't have the genetic mutations. John Sanford is a really great guy, by the way. He came through and spoke to our Ratio Christi group, and he was also part of our Young Earth and Old Earth science track at the symposium just a few weeks ago in Charlotte. In my personal conversations with John, and in his relationship with Reasons to Believe, with Fuzz Rana at Reasons to Believe, he was in agreement that the mutation rates are very difficult to pinpoint to a specified time, and that the age of mankind is compatible with age estimates, even on the level of what Reasons to Believe has estimated for the length of time of mankind on the Earth. And even if I wanted to grant this particular argument for mankind, this seems like an awfully strange argument to be arguing for a young Earth, because even if I wanted to say, for example, that humans haven't been on the Earth for very long and can't stay on the Earth for very long, it really says nothing about the geologic age of the Earth itself. The only other thing I would point out is that cells do have the ability to repair themselves, including make genetic repairs. So there's some built-in processes here that God knew during the breakdown process that would keep species alive. And then there's a verse that's very interesting in Psalm 104, right after it's talking about land creatures and sea creatures. In verses, in verse 27, it says, "They all wait for you to give them their food in due season, and you give to them, they gather it up." Then a little bit further in verse 29, it says, "You hide your face, and they are dismayed. You take away their spirit, they expire, and they return to dust. You send forth your spirit, and they are created, and you renew the face of the ground." So as these things break down, as a progressive creationist like myself, I believe God progressively created animals over a period of time as they were able to survive on the Earth, as the conditions were right. And humans have really, advanced life has only been able to survive on the Earth for a short amount of time, and that's the reason why advanced life has only been here for a short amount of time compared to, say, the 4.5 billion years that the Earth has been around. So that's what I'd say about that.
Jay, your response?
Well, I think that the fact this one article in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, why they asked why have we not died 100 times over, has a time implication. And basically my argument in my book, I try to argue from philosophy, history, biology, and geology. So from the history, if man only goes back so far, he's been intelligent. God gave man a rational mind, and we're made in the image of God. And so that history goes back, and in some cultures, say, by the connection between the Toltecs and the Mayans, they actually nail down creation itself to a pretty close state to what Genesis recounts.
And what do you think about that, Ben?
Well, again, if he's going to go with whatever ancient civilization nailed down a particular date, we're still only talking about, at best, a historical estimate since humans have been here. It tells us nothing about how long the Earth has been here before humans ever arrived.
Well, we got enough time if we can give one more argument from the older perspective. So, Ben, what's another scientific argument that made you really decide, okay, I'm really struggling with this YEC thing now? What was another strong argument that made you think the Earth is over?
One of the ones that really became very convincing to me had to do with what are known as lake varves. It's a term most people aren't familiar with, but a varve is nothing more than a sedimentary layer, and they usually come in two forms, or couplets as they're called. There's a light layer and a darker layer. And varves are formed, and they can be observed forming today in the deep water of certain still lakes. In other words, lakes that don't have a lot of water movement going on in them. And then they can core the bottom of these lakes and see how many layers are down there. It's sort of like looking at layers, tree ring samples, basically. There's a lake in Japan called Lake Sujitsu, which has over 100,000 of these little varve couplets in terms of layers that go down. And the layers, what they are is they're alternating types of material. One of the layers is formed during the warmer months, and it's basically consisting of organic materials like diatoms, pollens, in some cases insect parts and plant parts. And then in the winter months, when there's really nothing, when life is not quite as strong going on there in the lake, it forms an inorganic layer mostly of very fine-grained sediments. And these types of sediments, diatom shells and fine-grained material that's basically blown into the lake, takes a long time to settle down through the lake and will not settle in fast-moving water. So what you've got is you've got alternating varves or layers at the bottom of the lake, over 100,000 of them, that show that again can't be formed by fast-moving water, that show that the bottom of the lake is at least been accumulating material for somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 years. And then the other part that goes along with this is you can coordinate the layers with the amount of carbon-14 decay in each of the layers. So they've been able to use the layers to calibrate carbon-14 dating. And the ratio of carbon-14 and carbon-12 that you find in the various layers shows the amount of decay that is consistent with the number of layers that goes down through there. So again, what you've got is two methods of dating it, carbon-14 and layering the layer counts that are consistent with one another, and you've got 45,000 to 50,000 years worth of decay being recorded there in the sediments. So anybody who would want to come along and say that it's not that old would have to explain how you got that many layers and why the carbon-14 decay is consistent with the layering counts. So that became that was very convincing to me that at least that lake bottom is at least 100,000 years old.
Well, Jay, what do you think of that?
Well, a quick comment on the radiocarbon dating, and then I'll talk about some of these layers. When we look at the historical things that we can date, maybe an old chair that maybe King Henry VIII used to have, or something like this, past 400 BC, radiocarbon has some serious problems. It's not all that accurate. Now, it may have some ballpark figures, so I'll grant you that. In other words, as you go deeper into these supposed VARV layers, that the radiocarbon dates get older, I don't have a problem with that in terms of that general sense. There's the lake in Switzerland, Walensee, that may have as many as 5 layers in a year in certain conditions. In terms of the layers alternating with the organic, that's something that I need to take some further research on. But in terms of just you can get layers, thin layers, in a fairly rapid time, I want to present some examples of that. A flood in Colorado in 1965 deposited 100 layers in just a matter of hours. 1960 flood, and I haven't seen this, so I don't know how the organic material lines out. But in terms of thin layers, can happen quickly. A 1960 flood deposited 6 inches of mud with a number of thin layers. And often the carbon-14 dates that I've seen for some of these situations are sometimes selected, and that's something that I think should be considered. One famous example is from the channeled Scablands, the famous Lake Missoula flood that was highlighted in a NOVA episode. In fact, it was just called Mega Flood. That's the name of the episode. But 300-foot thick, the Touche beds in Washington, they have a number of thin layers, and that's 300 feet. So, and of course, that was one great catastrophic event. So, in terms of the alternation with the organics, that's something I need to give some further thought. But I think there's plenty of evidence that thin layers in themselves can happen pretty quickly.
Okay. Ben, you want to wrap this point up here? What's your response to that?
Well, I would say that Jay's really obscuring the issue here, because when you're talking about are there geologic processes that can form thin lamina or thin layers quickly, I would say yes, there are. But the types of layers that you're talking about that are being formed there, like let's say the Mount St. Helens eruption, you're talking about thin layers of ash and mud that get accumulated. When you're talking about tidal actions, when the tide comes in and goes out and comes in and goes out, it can lay down little bitty layers, fairly quickly. But we're talking about maybe a centimeter of stuff accumulating over a period of a week or so. And the glacial lake that he talks about, you're talking about glacial meltwater that's coming down on a consistent basis. So yeah, you can have multiple layers in a lake in a year with multiple melts. But when we're talking about the VARV layers at the bottom of a still lake, like Lake Baikal in Russia, which has over 1 million layers, or some of the lakes in Michigan that have been studied in Wisconsin, or this particular lake in Japan, none of those quick processes apply, and quick processes simply cannot be applied to them because of the size of the particles that we're talking about. So talking about the fact that a lot of layers can be laid down quickly is apples and oranges compared to what we're talking about in the bottoms of these lakes.
Okay, Jay, let's have a quick time. You've got a little bit more time, and then we're going to move on to the biblical issues. So what do you think about that?
Well, sometimes gravity slumping can cause turbidites, and turbidites, of course, are layered formation, and I don't know exactly how the organics fit with that, but sometimes that does happen. I know another case in Switzerland where it was 90 centimeters, almost a meter thick.
Okay, well, I'd like to remind everyone right now you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast. Today we got Jay Hall on defending the young Earth position and Ben Smith on defending the old Earth position. And if you're listening next week, we're also going to have a science-based show. We're going to have a guy on here I think both of these gentlemen could like. We're going to have, for the second time on the show, J. Warner Wallace is going to come back to the show, and he's going to be my guest. We're going to be talking about his book, God's Crime Scene. Is there evidence for a creator looking largely at scientific evidence. So that's going to be what's going to be here next week. For now, we're going to get back to the debate, and we're going to spend this hour focusing on the biblical issues. Now, I honestly suspect that I don't have a hard day. It was just my suspicion that most people do hold to a young earth view of the Genesis based on the biblical account, because it just seems so straightforward. Day, evening, morning, 24 hours, everything's created. It just seems to make sense to a lot of people. Now, your position is a bit different. You hold to what's called a prophetic days view. So could you just explain what your view is and why you hold to it?
Sure. Well, for the longest time, I read Genesis like you're talking about, that it represented 6 normal days, and everything was completed in 6 normal days, and then God took a 7th day of rest, and it all proceeded from there. When I started reading Reasons to Believe material, he takes it as 6 literal time periods, 6-day ages, and I think that the exegetical evidence for that seemed a bit weak, and that the evidence was stronger on the young earth side, that they were normal days. So as I started studying various other views of Genesis, I came across a view known as the Days of Divine Fiat view. I like to call it the prophetic days view, just simply as an easier way of understanding what's going on here. The simple question in Genesis would be, were the proclamations that God spoke on each of the 6 days meant to be understood as being fulfilled on the day that he spoke them? When God speaks prophecies, when God speaks what's going to happen, it doesn't always happen immediately. And so as I began studying the text, I began realizing that the proclamations are stated in such a way that they really cannot be fulfilled in 6 days. And so my view is essentially, you can take Genesis literally and historically as a real 6 days of 24 hours on earth that occurred some time ago, but that week is sandwiched between 2 unspecified periods of time. There's the beginning before the 7 days, where God created the heavens and the earth, basically the universe, and then the time frame after the 7 days, where he fulfilled the proclamations or prophecies, if you will, that he spoke over the time of the 6 days. So he set a time frame, set an example for mankind by working for 6 days and resting on the 7th, and then he went about fulfilling his proclamations after that time. And because there are 2 unspecified periods of time in there, before and after the week of creation, or week of proclamation, I should say, Genesis doesn't specify the age of the earth, and so that's in essence my view.
Well, Jay, I have to say that when Ben sent me his book, I had never heard of this view before, and I was fairly surprised by it. I saw some things that I thought, yeah, I could see where this is coming from, but had you ever heard this view before? And either way, what's your response to it?
No, I was not familiar with it. I haven't read a lot on Old Earth perspective except for Arthur Custance. I think he may actually be the only books that I've read that came from a more Old Earth perspective. Well, one counter, I think, is the use of the Toledoths in Genesis, and I know there's different views on that, but sometimes it can be translated, this is the history of, and the classic book that kind of defends the view that they're actually at the end was P.J. Wiseman, New Discoveries in Babylonia about Genesis. That was published in 1946. Basically, he discovered the ancient Near East literature and found a certain pattern. Often, records just jump right into the middle of the story, and there's no heading. And then, let's say this was recorded on a number of tablets. Each tablet ends with a Toledoth, and then it refers to what happened before. So they're at the end. And then the person named in the Toledoth is the person that either wrote that section or that owned the tablet. Mm-hmm. And so one is repeated, Esau. But normally, most people, at least from the young earth side of it, usually count it as 10. You have heavens and the earth, Adam, Noah, Noah's sons, Shem, Terah, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, and Jacob. And so you have these 10 Toledoths at the end, and because that unites Genesis, and because the stories of Isaac or Jacob or and so forth are consecutive history, I think it makes more sense to interpret Genesis 1 as consecutive history. And if you do have $75, you can get a more updated version, which is Clues to Creation in Genesis by the same author, and then edited, I'm assuming, by his son, D.J. Wiseman.
Well, Ben, what do you think about what Jay just said in response there?
Well, the Toledoth idea is not a problem, actually. I tend to agree with it. Now, the scholars well, they differ in opinion on whether there's 10 or 11 Toledoths. I'm of the opinion that there's 11 and there's 12 sections of Genesis, which is a more biblical number, instead of there being 11. And I would say that that young earth creationists don't necessarily limit it to 11 sections. I also agree that Genesis 1, which is, or verses 1:1 through 2:3 or 2:4a, make up the first Toledoth, and I do believe it is a historical account. But just because but that says nothing about gaps of time that may be represented in the account themselves. So what he had to say doesn't necessarily deal specifically with my view of Genesis, and I don't disagree necessarily with the tablet view of Genesis that Moses may have used source material in putting Genesis together. But the initial account itself, the real question is, did the proclamations occur on the day that they were said to happen? And the evidence in the text says that can't be the case. So the problem we have in old earth creationism is that we have 9 different views of Genesis, at least 9. Some say 10. I've seen as many as 16 listed, but we've got a bunch of different views of Genesis on the old earth side, and the young earth side's got one view. And that is our problem right now, is that we're struggling to come up with what we really think Genesis says. But what he had to say didn't necessarily deal specifically with my view of Genesis.
Well, let's go to some hard questions now, and then I'm going to start with what I consider a hard question for you, is that the biblical account says that when God created everything, he created everything very, very good. But if the earth is old, you got things like dinosaurs dying, death, destruction, predation, all going on in what's supposed to be a good earth. And how can we say this is a good earth if death is going on?
Well, that term, very good, is a subjective term. Let's put it that way. We would have to let the Bible define for us what very good means. And in this case, the way I like to answer this question is, I hate by asking a question, but it's a rhetorical question. Is it very good for mankind that rats and roaches die? And I would say yes, because if rats and roaches didn't die, it wouldn't be long before they overtook the earth and ate everything, all of the resources here on the earth. So
I can honestly assure you that my wife would say it would be abundantly good for humankind if every bug would just die.
Yeah, my wife would heartily agree that the only good roach is a dead roach.
Right.
So very good is one of those subjective terms in the account. Very good means that the finished creation was the way God intended it to be to accomplish his purposes. And animal death is not necessarily very bad, for example. Animal death, I actually believe that in my book I discuss a number passages that talk about how animal death was actually intended by God in the beginning. For example, God blessed sea creatures to fill the seas, but he only told the birds to multiply on the land, and he didn't bless the land animals to fill the land. He only blessed mankind to fill the land. So his intent was that mankind would fill the land and sea creatures would fill the seas, and if mankind accomplished that mandate, even if it had been possible before the fall, if he had accomplished that, then birds and land animals would have been limited. So some of them would have had to have been moved out. In essence, it would have led to their death. So it was never God's intention for animal death not to occur on the earth, and that would be my response to that.
Okay, Jay, do you think this is a problem for the older view, and what do you think about what Ben just said?
Well, I think that is a very key aspect in terms of the tragedies that we have. If you interpret death and other kinds of physical suffering due to the fall, then I think it makes more sense of tragedies like cancer and so forth like that. But in terms of animal death, is that part of the original plan? And Ben, I really appreciate that more than anything I've read, you've in your book you cover many of these objections, and and in your bibliography you cover a number of creationist works, and I do appreciate that. And so you've actually dealt with these issues, but I want to bring them up. In Isaiah 65 we read, "The wolf and the lamb will graze together, and the lion will eat straw like an ox, and dust will be the serpent's food. They will do no evil or harm in all my holy mountain, says the Lord." That's out of Isaiah 65. And there's a parallel passage, of course, in Isaiah 11. Now, some rats can be fun. Maybe y'all had guinea pigs as pets. So it does depend on the context. And then Job specifically talked about, say, for like other things like trees, that there's a difference. Because he talked about there's a hope for a tree. When it is cut down, it'll sprout again. But when man dies, he lies prostrate. Man expires. Where is he? In Job 14. So how do we relate to all these animals and what would have happened? Well, God knew the fall would happen. It talks about the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. But even if you consider the potential, kind of a hypothetical scenario of Adam and Eve, it would take quite a while to fill the whole earth. And even with today's current population, it's almost like a saying, the whole world could live in Houston, and I believe that's probably literally true. So it would take a while to do that. And you could even go with the option that we, had space stations or space traveled, sort of like C.S. Lewis' Space Trilogy. But I don't think we have to go there, because God knew that the fall would happen. Mm-hmm. Now, here's an interesting story about animal death, is when Nathan confronted David. The ewe lamb the guy had as a pet was like a daughter, and then the other guy killed it, and we have a sense that that's evil. And so if we think of like dog fights or horse fights like they have in the Philippines where my wife is from, we have a sense that animal death is just terrible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ben, what do you think about that?
Well, animal death can't be that terrible because God commanded it, but in the case of the lamb, I would just simply say that the reason that it was terrible is because the little girl might have thought it was like a pet, and that's the reason why it might have been bad to kill the family pet. In terms of the way animals are designed, though, even within the young earth creationist literature these days, there's a difference of opinion on whether all death occurred at the fall or whether God allowed the death of, say, invertebrates. Jonathan Sarfati, for example, in all of his works, says that the death before the fall issue with animals only occurred as a result, or only happened to more advanced type of life, and that God basically designed certain invertebrates like insects and various forms of life in the ocean to die or be food for other creatures. It's kind of hard to say, for example, that God didn't design spiders not to eat other insects, along with a whole host of other animals that are designed to eat insects like chameleons and frogs. I mean, what good is a chameleon's long sticky tongue if it was not designed to eat insects. In terms of Isaiah 65 is a prophetic passage. It's also literature that is apocalyptic, and apocalyptic literature always involves highly symbolic types of language. There's a whole lot going on in Isaiah 65. Just because God talks about the lion laying down with the lamb and the lion eating straw doesn't mean that that's the way it was before the fall. And it also talks about that those things only occur in God's holy mountain, according to those passages. So it could be talking about select spots where that may be the case, where it's representative of total peace. So I would be hesitant to use in either Isaiah 11 or 65 to prove a position that animals never died prior to the fall. And foreknowledge can kind of work both ways in terms of God knowing that mankind was going to fall. The simple fact of the matter is it looks like God created animals with defense structures, with the ability to hunt down and kill other things for their food. And I see no indication in Scripture that any of that changed as a result of the fall. So my implication would be, if it says God created animals, and we see animals as predators and prey today, then the conclusion from that is God made them the way we see them today, unless the Bible tells us otherwise. And I've just not seen any convincing evidence the Bible tells us otherwise.
Okay. Jay, what do you think about that?
Well, I would hold to the usual creationist viewpoint that man and animals originally had a vegetarian diet. And again, it doesn't explicitly state, and therefore, nobody killed anything. It's just that I think that was the ideal, that from the beginning, to have a vegetarian diet.
And final response from you on this point, Ben.
Okay, on vegetarianism, I would simply point out that Genesis 1:29 through 30 is a permissive statement, not a prohibitive statement. In other words, God is telling Adam and Eve what they can eat in the garden. It's sort of like in their innocence, and they would be hungry because that's the way God made them. In their innocence, He's telling them, look, it's okay for you to eat these particular things in the garden. Later, I believe He would have given them further instruction on potentially eating animals, and I don't see a problem with that. Adam and Eve, in the story of Cain and Abel, for example, I realize this is after the fall, but in the story of Cain and Abel, you have a very interesting little point that's made there, and that is when Abel brought his sacrifice to the Lord, it included the fat of some of the animals, which means that they were slaughtering animals immediately in their lifetime there, and they were using all parts of the animals for various things. The fat was valuable to the humans, otherwise it wouldn't have been a sacrifice. And fat can be used for cooking, it can be used for burning in the lamps and so forth, but I would think that they would have been told that not only were they making their clothes out of the animal skins and then using the fat, but they would have also been eating the meat. And since they weren't told they couldn't do it, there's nothing in the Bible that says don't eat meat. It just simply says, here, you're permitted to eat this. So I just think it's an exaggeration of the text to interpret that to mean that it was intended to be vegetarian only, when it's nothing more than a permissive statement and does not prohibit them from eating meat.
Okay. Well, it's a little bit earlier than I normally do it, but before I get into the next round of questions, I want to remind everyone that you're listening to the Deeper Waters podcast, and everything that I do here, it's listener supported, and it can take a lot to prepare for this show. I mean, a lot of what we do here, it's really low budget. It's just me sitting at my computer with a microphone, a program to record using Audacity, and Skype. That's pretty much it for the most part. And the work that I really do a lot is reading the books and material that all these people send me beforehand. In the midst of this, I'm doing my own studies because, as listeners know, I'm currently working on my master's in New Testament at Johnson University. And for all of this, we could really use your support. So if you want to support us, go to my blog page at deeperwaters.ddns.net, and there's a link, Help Support the Work of Deeper Waters Christian Ministries. And if you go there, you can find a donation page that you can go to, and that'll take you to Risen Jesus Ministries. You have gone to the right place. That's the ministry of my father-in-law and his wife, Mike and Debbie Lacona. And when you go there, you can make a donation, and when you email me or Mike or Debbie or even my wife Allie and say, hey, I made a donation, I want to go to Nick Peters, I want to go to Deeper Waters, and they'll make sure we get it, and it will be tax deductible. And also, up until the end of December here, the Risen Jesus has a matching grant gift that's been given to him, because Mike's hope really is he wants to take me on full time to be on staff at Risen Jesus. I need a certain amount of money to get that. So if you make a donation now to Mike's ministry, whatever you make, it will be doubled until the end of the year. And that gets us closer to me being able to come and work full time on Mike's ministry. And we're already discussing a lot of the things we're going to do, and Deeper Waters could be partnering then with Risen Jesus. Deeper Waters will still be Deeper Waters, and they have told me, Mike and Debbie have said, we want to make sure, though, if you're going to come on staff, you have to keep doing your blog and you have to keep doing your podcast. And I'm like, oh gosh, okay, I guess I have to. Which, of course, you all should know I speak sarcasm very fluently. Now, you can also support us. Unfortunately, the Amazon store we was in buying books, I didn't do something right, and Amazon decided to chuck the whole thing. So I'm going to have to get that started again. I'll probably do that after ETS, EPS. But you can also support us by going to Amazon and finding books that I've written or co-written, such as A Creed for the Ages, or Defining Inerrancy, or Groundless, or Christian Answers for This Generation's Questions, or God and Natural Disasters. And when you buy any of those books, then we get a small amount of proceeds from what you have. And please consider, if you buy those books, writing a good review. I really like reviews, and heck, if you like this podcast, please write a good review of this podcast. And finally, you can go to a jewelry store we have a link to, because I don't need to tell you this, the women in your life tend to love jewelry. I mean, my wife even has an allergic reaction to nickel, so we have to be very careful where we get her, but even she would love to wear jewelry, too. So if you go to our store, there's steps where you can take, you can make a purchase, and let's suppose you buy a necklace for $100. You let Lena Clester know, who runs the premier store, 25% of that will go to Deeper Waters. That means you buy a $100 item for your wife, you get good brownie points with her to stay out of the doghouse, and you get to donate $25 to Deeper Waters at the same time. That is a win-win deal. Now, Jay, do you have an organization or a charity you'd like to see people donate to?
Well, I'd just like to suggest Billy Graham, because when I was a young Christian, his literature, especially his discipleship literature, was very helpful for me.
Okay. And Ben, what about you?
I agree with Jay that any number of evangelical or even orphan-type organizations would be good to look at. On my website, which is discoveringthetruthministries.com, there's a number of apologetics ministries listed there that I recommend that work by donation. And if anybody feels so led to support me, I would not turn it away. Mm-hmm. I love Frank Turek's line on that when he says, any money you give goes to support hungry children, and he's talking about his own.
Yeah. Of course, I might not be doing that as much anymore, since I understand the kids are already moved out and such. And he talked about it did take a long time to adjust, which was about 10 minutes. That's how long it took to change all the locks. Okay, so let's get back into the debate. I'd like to ask Jay what I consider a hard question. Ben was talking about how Isaiah 65 is an apocalyptic thing, and it kind of worked very well with what I was thinking would be a good question, that a lot of times some Christians could accuse the young earth position of having a strong literalism that we want to avoid, especially when you have things like the Dake Study Bible, where you decide to interpret everything in a literal sense and end up with a sort of tritheism going on. Do you think you're being guilty of literalism here?
Well, the term that I most often like to use is historical narrative, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with the work of Stephen Boyd at the Master's Seminary, who did a statistical study of the Hebrew verbs and compared it to poetry. So he definitely showed from a statistical angle that it's narrative. Mm-hmm. And yes, I mean, we talk about sunrise and sunset even today, and so does the Bible. And so I realize that's the sort of thing, and you have to interpret things based on its genre. And, you know, there's umpteen different interpretations of, say, the book of Revelation. So I do agree you have to be careful. But I think, for me, for Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, I do believe it reads as pretty much straightforward. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. I think it seems to be pretty a straightforward way to interpret it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ben, what do you think about that?
I actually agree with Jay on that one. Mm-hmm. I believe that passages of Scripture should be interpreted based on their genre, and I agree that even though Genesis 1 is a unique passage of Scripture in the sense that it is historical narrative and it used those types of verbs, it's also highly structured. It has a very high structure to the account with a series of repeated phrases and parallel. It's not Hebrew poetry parallelism, but there is a parallel type account between days 1 through 3 and 4 through 6, for example. So there's a high structure to Genesis 1, but it is historical narrative, and as such, I agree that it should be interpreted in a literal fashion. There is a danger always of being too literalistic with certain passages, because if you're too literalistic, then God has wings and is an actual rock and things like that. But you don't have that type of symbolism going on in the Genesis passages. So I actually agree that with Jay that it should be taken as historical narrative.
Well, normally I'd get a counter response here, but since you two agree, there's not much point in doing that kind of thing. I mean, I think a bit more Jay could say, "Yep, okay." So, Jay, let's go to you now. Then Ben's given his position. Why do you think the text should be interpreted to read from a young Earth case?
Well, I believe, of course, there's Exodus 20:11. Which puts the creation of everything into 6 days and compares it to our work week and then the Sabbath. But in terms of how everything's connected, in terms of Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 1:2, Genesis 1:2 starts with a wow disjunctive, which indicates here's something else I need to tell you about what I just said.
Okay, let's be clear at this point. When you say the wow disjunctive, that's a Hebrew word. We're not saying something like "wow."
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I've heard it sometimes spelled "vav," and I'm no Hebrew scholar, so I don't know what the best way to say it is. But W-A-W is how I've seen it spelled in most books. I've heard that it could be translated as, well, that's to say, or namely, and that it connects the two. And then in terms of the other actions in Genesis, there's 50 rather. Wow consecutives, W-A-W, and that's the fourth highest of all of the chapters from Genesis 1 to 20. So basically I'm asking, why should we treat Genesis 1 any differently, that it's regular historical narrative? So if we're reading the account of maybe the spies going into the promised lands and then turning a thumbs down, that they saw the giants in the land and so forth, whatever it might be, or say a story about Jacob rather, or a story about Esau and Abraham going on his journeys, we take it as, well, this happened and this happened, rather than saying it's some kind of a prophetic proclamation.
Hey, well, Ben, that sounds like an interesting case to make. It. Do you find it persuasive any?
Well, there's two things going on here, and I think we need to pursue them separately, actually, because he brought up Exodus 20:11, and I'd like to give my explanation of that,
okay.
Which I'll do in just a second. But it is Vav or Vav is I believe the correct pronunciation of it, even when it's spelled W-A-W. It's a Hebrew letter, and it's usually translated as and there is a Vav disjunction at 1-2, and most of it is Vav consecutives. The problem is even though it's historical narrative type verb structure going on there, the question, even among scholars, has always been that it's not always in chronological order, and that is the issue. Genesis is not in chronological order, which is something I would have to work out. But if we can come back to that issue in just a second. On Exodus 20:11, most people are very familiar with it. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. There's really three things that has to be taken into account when translating this particular verse. Number one, it does not use the word create. It doesn't say, for in 6 days the Lord created the heavens and the earth. It says, for in 6 days the Lord made, which is the Hebrew word asah, which has a very broad sense in Hebrew. It's most often translated as a form of the verb to do, as in do, did, done, that type of thing. But it also refers to a whole host of other words, including things like trim your fingernails, for example. So if I were to ask you, where do you get your nails done, you would know what I meant. But if I said, where do you get your nails made, well, that would mean something completely different, even if we understood it was talking about fingernails. So what word we use to translate Exodus 20:11 is important. I believe if you study that word out in its entirety, a general definition of the word asah would mean to cause something to happen. It's a causality word. So for example, the first time that it's used of human action, God asks Eve after she's taken of the fruit that she wasn't supposed to. She says, what is this that you have done? So it's a causality word. In other words, what are you responsible for is really what he's asking her. Secondly, in the passage, it's Exodus 20:11 is written from a surface perspective of the earth, and I'll show you I'll explain that in just a second. And then the word in, for in 6 days, that word in is not actually in the Hebrew. So if you take all three of those together, I believe that the best way to understand Exodus 20:11 is to say, for 6 days the Lord caused the human perspective of the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, which is exactly what I believe he did. Initially, the human perspective from the surface of the earth, according to Genesis 1:2, is that everything was dark. So if you were a hypothetical observer standing on the earth in Genesis 1:2, you wouldn't be able to see anything because it was completely dark. So God then did a literal 6-day work. For 6 days, the Lord he did a 6-day work that caused our human perspective of the heavens and the sea, the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them. But it didn't necessarily, it wasn't necessarily fulfilled within that 6 days. In other words, God did a 6-day work that caused it, but it was fulfilled in the time frame afterward. So that would be my explanation of Exodus 20:11. If he wants to respond to that, then I can explain why the account is not necessarily in chronological order.
Okay, Jay, how about, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. I think that in the context of Exodus 20:11, it clearly refers to the 6 days of creation. And then in Genesis 1, it's clear that on each day what happens, and I think that the things that are described happen on those days. For example, the sun was made on day 4, because there's other Hebrew words for, say, it appeared, if that's another view. And I know that Ben has talked about this, but of course the classic references say in Psalm 33, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. And then it goes, for he spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. And there's a similar expression in Psalm 148. So I think those indicate that on each day these things happened. And if you want to deal with the order in terms of the days, we could go on because there's quite a few. But say versus the standard mainstream dating viewpoint, like the earth before the sun is what Genesis teaches, light before the sun, seas before dry land, flowers before insects, trees before land animals, etc., etc. So in terms of something being out of sequence, the standard mainstream, the geological time scale, so to speak, contradicts, I believe, what Genesis teaches.
Okay, what do you think about that, Ben?
I agree that the order that Genesis lists them in is not the order that they appeared from the surface perspective of the earth. On that, I would agree. The problem, though, is that if everything was dark from the surface perspective, and then God proclaimed everything to come to pass, as long as we understand that it didn't happen on the day that God proclaimed it, the order that it appears in after the week becomes irrelevant in that case, or the order that the text says that God proclaimed it becomes irrelevant in terms of the paleontological order that it appears on the earth. When it comes to the sun being created on day 4 or made on day 4, day 4 is specifically one of those passages that is actually out of chronological order that I talked about. In verse 14 it says, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens for the following purposes. And then in verse 15 it says, and it was so, or and it came to pass. In other words, the proclamation was fulfilled. And then in verse 16 it says God made the light. So it's obvious that it's out of chronological order, because if it was already so that the lights came to be in the expanse of the heavens, then why did God have to make the lights? In other words, if it was in chronological order, it should have read something like, and God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, and God made the lights, and it was so. But that's not the way the text reads. The text reads, the proclamation was for the lights to come to be in the expanding clear space of the heavens, which is what I think that phrase means, in the expanse of the heavens. God proclaimed for that to come to be from a perspective of the surface of the earth, and it was so. In other words, that proclamation came to pass over a period of time. And then in logical order, verse 16 says God made the light. The reason for that is if you were, let's say, an ancient and you didn't really have a science perspective as we do of Earth orbiting the sun, and your only perspective of the creation was from the surface of the earth, and you were told that God made a proclamation for the lights to come to be in the expanse, in your expanding view of the heavens, as soon as you could see what was causing the lights on the earth, the sun, moon, and stars, your next logical question would be, well, what caused that? And that's why verse 16 is out of chronological order. It just simply says, as a parenthetical note, God made the sun, moon, and stars. It's letting the reader know that God originated those things as well that have now become visible from the surface of the earth. So that would be that'd be my response to that. In terms of other places in Genesis that I go into great depth in my book about each of the places where the text specifically says that a proclamation cannot be fulfilled in 24 hours.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Jay, do you have any response to that?
Well, I mentioned Psalm 148, but to follow up on that, it lists mountains, angels, the sun, the moon, the stars, the waters above the heavens, and then it says, let them praise the name of the Lord, for he commanded and they were created. That's Psalm 148:5. And I think that's what happened on day 4, and the other phrase may be a summary statement.
Okay, well, then let's go back to you and get started on another track then. What is another reason that you think the passage should refer to an old earth instead of a young earth?
Well, to be clear on that, Nick, I don't think the Bible specifies the age of the earth. So okay. It's not that the Bible is saying that the earth is old. It's saying that it doesn't tell us how old the earth is, and therefore we're free to figure that part out on our own. But
I think Walter Kaiser once said something like, does the Bible tell you when it ought to took place? I said, yes, in the beginning. It just doesn't tell you when the beginning is. Is that what you're saying?
And that would be one of my arguments. There are two parts to my argument in terms of age being allowed in the Bible. There's an unspecified period of time before the 7 days, and then there's an unspecified period of time after the 7 days. The one you're referring to, in the beginning, I think it's pretty clear that Genesis 1:1 and 2 stand outside of the main narrative of verses 3 through 31. In other words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is telling us the first part of the creation that occurred before the 7 days began. There's a pattern in the text. Each of the days has a proclamation, and God said. In some cases it has 2 or 3 proclamations. But there's a proclamation, there's a fulfillment phrase, there's extra information that's given to us, like a parenthetical statement, there's the evening and morning phrase, and then there's a numbered day. But nowhere in between that phrase and God said and the numbered day is there anything about God making a proclamation for let there be a heavens and an earth. So we shouldn't just assume that something that lies outside the narrative or outside of that pattern belongs in it. So verses 1 and 2 are actually occurring before the 7 days begin, which is also supported by the Hebrew verb structure that Jay was talking about earlier, because the verb structure of verses 1 and 2 is different than verses 3 through 31. Mm-hmm. So in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, and the beginning refers to a block of time before the 7 days, not a specific moment of time. And I give all the evidence in my book about how the meaning of the word beginning refers to a block of time. Probably the easiest explanation is Jeremiah 28:1, which says, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, in the 4th year and the 5th month. Almost 4.5 years into King Zedekiah's 11-year reign is still considered the beginning of his reign. So the beginning is an unspecified block of time before the 7 days, which also lends evidence to the fact that not everything was done in 7 days. The passages that Jay's referring to that says God spoke and it came to be, I agree that God spoke and it came to be, but it doesn't say how long that took place, how long that was. So anyway.
Jay, what do you think about
See what Jay says about that?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to refer to the passages that are often tagged Jesus age verses. Mm-hmm. I'm sure both of you are aware of them. But in Mark 10:6, Jesus says, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And then the second one is Mark 13:19. For those days will be a time of tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which God created until now. And then in Luke 11:50 and 51, Jesus speaks so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. And I think that the reference to the beginning of creation and the foundation of the world literally means when the universe began.
Okay, well, Ben, that's something to consider. I mean, obviously you don't want to go against with what Jesus said, so are you doing that?
No, I wouldn't want to go against what Jesus said. I just believe that the interpretation of, say, the Mark 10 passages or the parallel passage in Matthew are not referring to the beginning of all of creation, but the beginning of creation of mankind, for example. And to go along to support that, Jesus quotes 2 passages from Genesis, and one is referring specifically to God made them male and female, which is Genesis 1:26 or 27, and then the other one is, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh, which is in Genesis 2. So both of those passages that Jesus is referring to are referring to the beginning of the creation of mankind specifically, not the beginning of creation in general. And besides, if we wanted to say that all that happened since the beginning of creation, the beginning of creation would have been day 1, not day 6. Anyway, those passages are referring to more specific, the beginning of a particular world, or beginning of a particular generation, or the beginning of the creation of mankind, not the beginning of everything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jay, what do you think about that?
Well, I think the beginning of creation being day 6, that Scripture uses a lot of round numbers, and I think that's the case. So percentage-wise, day 6 relative to, say, if we go with Usher's number of 4004 BC, that's pretty close. And I had the privilege to attend a NASCAR race last Saturday, the AAA Texas 500, and I know that there was one kind of a spin out. He did a 180. Now, I can't remember when it happened, but there were 334 laps. Let's just say that it happened on the 4th lap. I could say, oh, yeah, there was this wild spin out at the beginning of the race. Well, it didn't literally happen at time 00. It happened at the 4th lap. But relative to 334 laps, it was on the 4th lap. Mm-hmm. And there is another parallel passage that we can read in the book of Acts. And it says in Acts 3:21, quote, the times of the restoration of all things which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. And Greek is ionos, however you pronounce that, and it's sometimes translated eternal. But in the New King James it says since the world began. And so it gives the same point as the passage in Luke 11 does.
Okay, a final response on this from you, Ben?
I would just believe that the word world there is not referring to the entire creation. The way the way the Bible talks about different worlds, like in the world of Noah's day, for example, in the Peter passage, by referring to the world of Noah's day, it's implying that there were different worlds at different times. So the world of Peter and the world of Noah are two different things. So in Acts, since the world began, would be referring to the world of the beginning of mankind on the earth.
Okay. Well, Jay, let's go back to you. We've only got a few minutes left, but give us another brief argument for why you think the text should be read to show the earth is young.
All right. Well, I think the connections are that Adam was made on day 6, mm-hmm. and we can go to Genesis 5 and 11 to connect up the genealogies, and it's pretty much generally acknowledged that Abraham was alive around 2000 BC. Mm-hmm. And consider what we read in Daniel, where it talks about 10,000 times 10,000. And then Daniel 7:10, and that winds up to 100 million. That's a lot. Mm-hmm. So if God wanted to use specific numbers of vast ages, I mean, he could have done so. And speaking of Daniel, it's an excellent point that time matters. God knows the future. Things happen for a purpose, and you mentioned about natural disasters and such. Like I have a student that I really, really appreciate, and she came in this direction because of a Hurricane Katrina. I probably would have never met her. I had opportunity to go to New Orleans last year, but I probably would have never met her if that hadn't happened. So oftentimes, God has a great purpose in some sad things that happen. But Daniel specifically predicted when Christ came to the earth, and so time does matter.
Okay. Ben, what do you think about that?
Well, what is time to an omnipresent God, I guess would be my question to it. Length of time it takes to create the earth is irrelevant in my mind in terms of overall time frame. It's not a waste of time. It's not a waste of energy. In fact, it shows a picture of the eternal nature of God and the even the omnipotent nature of God better than a short time frame from a human perspective. Time matters to God from a human perspective. Yes, I mean, he's specific with times in prophecies. I agree with you on the Daniel prophecy, for example. He does all things according to his, in his time frame and so forth. But in terms of if he told us that he made a proclamation and he didn't tell us how long it took for it to take place, then I don't have a problem with it taking place over a long period of time. If that's, if he doesn't tell us how long it was, then if we're free to examine that by our own views, then I think that's a wise thing for God to do, to not specify a specific age in the Bible. At best, the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, if there are no gaps in them, which I would argue that there are, but if there aren't, at best that only gives us the beginning of mankind, again, not the geological or astronomical age of the Earth.
Okay. Jay, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that in terms of the Neanderthals, that we're connected, and that the estimate is the 1 to 4% of our DNA comes from that, and it goes back hundreds of thousands of years. So if humans have to be pushed back that far, and again, you can go to like 23andme.com, the number 23, and it used to cost $99. Well, I guess they want to make a little more profit. It's $199, that is now, if you want to do that. Our history professor did it, and he showed me some of the results. It's quite interesting. For most Eastern Asians, it's about 2.6% of their DNA comes from Neanderthals. So if we, and of course they buried their dead in a ceremonial manner. They had a hyoid blown, so they spoke. So I think you have to say that Neanderthal is my brother, and that Geico is wrong when they have those caveman commercials. So we have to push humanity back hundreds of thousands of years.
Okay. Ben, your response to wrap it up?
More specifically, for information on that, I would really refer to Fuz Rana's and Hugh Ross's book, Who Was Adam? They go into the fact that they believe that Neanderthals are pre-human and that they weren't fully human. How some of their DNA could have ended up in us, there's two possibilities that or three maybe possibilities. Number one, it may just be similar because it has similar function. Number two, if it is actually Neanderthal, it could be from a sinful condition, possibly referring to what was going on in terms of happening before the flood. That's another possibility. But I don't believe that Neanderthals, the archaeological evidence for them doesn't show them to have the same kind of technologies that we do. I don't believe they were fully human. But in terms of the specifics of that, I would really refer to Fuz Rana's book.
Well, gentlemen, it's been an interesting discussion here, and I can't say I'm not surprised that we didn't have anyone suddenly decide to convert to the other side. I don't think any of us was thinking that would happen. But I think we've had a good discussion. I hope both you would agree that everyone can be better informed on this topic now and learn to make their own decisions a lot more. So, Jay, do you have a blog or website, a way that people can get in touch with you if they want to find out more about you and what you're doing?
Sure. The best place to contact me is YoungEarthScienceBook.com. YoungEarthScienceBook.com.
Okay. And your book is the Young Earth Science and the Dawn of the New World View, Older Fallacies and the Collapse of Darwinism. That is available on paperback for $8.88 on Amazon right now, and it's available on Kindle for $3.45. Now, Ben, do you have a blog or website where people get in touch with you if they want to find out more?
I don't have a blog, but I plan to start one in the future. But my website is discoveringthetruthministries.com. I know that's long, but there just aren't that many short ones available anymore. Discoveringthetruthministries.com. You can contact me there. My book is, you're probably going to say, is available on Amazon and Kindle as well. Yep. It is more of a theological perspective. From a scientific perspective, on geology, I would recommend the book The Bible, Rocks and Time by Davis Young and Ralph Stearley. and then Hugh Ross's book, A Matter of Days, from the astronomical viewpoint, if you want the science on those two.
Okay,
So,
and your book is available for $16.99 in paperback and $8.99 in Kindle right now on Amazon.
correct.
Now, Jay, do you have any final message you'd like to leave with the Deeper Waters audience today?
Well, I think this dialogue is important. We need to hear each other out, and you hear one side, and as it says in Proverbs, it sounds right until you hear the other side, the other viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Ben, any final words from you?
I agree with that, and I also appreciate Jay's gentle attitude on it, and that not calling me a heretic or anything like that. And I don't think he's an idiot.
Yeah.
And it's good to know both sides of this, and not to have and to exhibit Christ's attitude on it. And let's exemplify the fruits of the Spirit and have a discussion about the facts, and not get into a name calling type of situation. So I appreciate that Jay has been that way.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. In fact, I happen to be, as you all know, an old earther, and I'm married to a young earther, and it's never been a source of division between us. In fact, usually if she's going to ask something about a position, she'll say, okay, what do you think? And I'll tell her what I think, and she'll say, and what would someone from my position be likely to say? And I'll try and give her the best answer that I can, because I want her to have the best answer that she can, and go out and study these kinds of things on her own as well without my pressure. And, well, guys, I'd like to thank you all for coming back, and hopefully we'll see you back here again sometime.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nick. I hope to be back too.
And I'd like to remind everyone that next week we're going to have J. Warner Wallace return of Cold Case Christianity, talk about his book, God's Crime Scene. For now, I'm Nick Peters, and I am signing off.